The sky did not warn them. It did not darken or rumble first. It simply erupted, as if the heavens themselves had split open and decided to pour destruction straight down onto the island. For a fraction of a second, there was silence and unnatural pause that made seasoned soldiers lift their heads in confusion. Then the world exploded. American artillery slammed into the earth with a violence that felt personal. The ground heaved like a living thing in pain, tossing men against walls, snapping support beams, crushing radios and maps beneath falling debris. Fire leapt from the soil, and the air itself seemed to tear apart as shells screamed overhead. Japanese officers who had endured years of brutal warfare froze, their instincts failing them, their minds struggling to comprehend the scale of what was happening. This was not bombardment as they knew it. This was annihilation delivered with mechanical precision. General Masao Tanaka stood inside a reinforced command bunker carved deep into rock, his hand braced against a trembling table. Dust poured from the ceiling in steady streams, coating maps and documents in gray powder. Each impact felt closer than the last, as though the Americans were slowly tightening a fist around the island. He had been told these bunkers could withstand anything. He had been assured that American firepower was exaggerated, a myth created to frighten the weak. Now, as steel groaned and the lights flickered, those assurances sounded like lies whispered by men who had never stood beneath this kind of storm. Outside, entire hillsides were being erased. Gun emplacements that had taken months to construct vanished in flashes of orange and white. Trees snapped like matchsticks. Men ran, some toward their positions, others away from them, only to be swallowed by shock waves that lifted their bodies and hurled them through the air. Screams were torn apart mid-breath by explosions that arrived faster than fear itself. Tanaka's radio operator shouted something, but the words dissolved in the roar. The radio spat static, then went dead. One by one, communication lines fell silent, not because men had stopped talking, but because there was no one left to answer. The Americans were not firing blindly. Every shell landed where it would hurt the most. Ammunition depots erupted like miniature suns. Supply tunnels collapsed, sealing soldiers inside with nothing but darkness and dust-filled lungs. A younger officer stumbled into the bunker, blood running from his scalp, his eyes wide and unfocused. "General," he gasped, "the coastal guns are gone. All of them. In minutes. They didn't even stop firing." His voice cracked, not from pain, but from something worse, shock. Tanaka felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold stone walls. Coastal guns were supposed to hold for hours, even days. They were the first line, the pride of their defenses. Gone in minutes meant the Americans had not just superior weapons, but overwhelming ones. It meant they had planned for this exact moment, measured it, calculated it, and executed it without hesitation. Another shell struck close enough to throw everyone to the floor. The lights went out completely, plunging the bunker into darkness broken only by the dull red glow of emergency lamps. For a moment, Tanaka thought the ceiling would collapse entirely. He imagined being buried alive, his final thought not of honor or duty, but of the terrible mistake they had made in underestimating their enemy. In the dark, someone whispered a prayer. Another man laughed, short and sharp, the sound of a mind cracking under pressure. Tanaka pushed himself up and forced his voice to remain steady. "Hold your positions," he ordered, though he knew many of those positions no longer existed. Orders felt meaningless now, words tossed into a hurricane. Above ground, American naval guns continued their relentless rhythm. There was no dramatic pause, no respect for night or day, just constant methodical destruction. Each impact was followed by another, then another, as if the very concept of mercy had been removed from the equation. Japanese soldiers who had sworn to fight to the last man now found themselves fighting to simply stay alive for another minute. An older general, Colonel Ishida, emerged from a side corridor, his uniform torn, his face streaked with grime. He looked at Tanaka with an expression that mixed awe and dread. "This firepower," he said slowly as another explosion shook the bunker, "it exceeds anything reported. anything imagined. He hesitated, then added in a voice barely above the thunder, "We have misjudged them." Those words carried more weight than any shell. To admit misjudgment was to admit failure at the highest level. For years, the Japanese command had believed that American soldiers lacked the spirit for prolonged, brutal warfare. They had believed machines could not replace will. Now, those machines were speaking louder than any human courage ever could. As hours passed, time lost meaning. The bombardment blurred into a continuous wall of sound and force. Eardrums ruptured, lungs burned with dust and smoke. Water supplies were contaminated by debris and fuel. Medics worked frantically, only to be overwhelmed by casualties arriving faster than they could be treated. Some men begged to be sent back to the front, preferring bullets to waiting helplessly underground. Others sat in silence, staring at nothing, their faces empty. Tanaka ventured briefly outside during a lull that lasted less than a minute. The sight stole his breath. The landscape he had known was unrecognizable. What had once been defensive lines were now craters, overlapping craters, filled with fire and twisted metal. Bodies lay everywhere, some whole, many not. The smell was unbearable, mixture of burned earth, fuel, and flesh. In the distance, American shells continued to fall with merciless accuracy, creeping closer like an advancing tide. He realized then that this was not simply about winning a battle. This was about erasing resistance entirely. The Americans were not trying to frighten them into surrender. They were grinding them down systematically until nothing remained that could fight back. When Tanaka returned to the bunker, his face was pale beneath the grime. He gathered the remaining officers, their ranks now thinned by death and injury. For a moment, no one spoke. The bombardment filled the silence, punctuating it with violent reminders of reality. Finally, Ishida broke the quiet. "We trained for courage," he said bitterly, "for sacrifice. But how does one sacrifice against this?" He gestured helplessly toward the shaking walls. "How does one charge a storm made of steel?" No one answered. There was no answer to give. Deep within his chest, Tanaka felt something collapse. Not fear, he had known fear before, but certainty. The certainty that doctrine, tradition, and belief could carry them through anything. That certainty was being pounded into dust above their heads. He understood with brutal clarity that the Americans had brought not just soldiers, but an industrial force capable of reshaping the battlefield at will. This was war transformed into production, into mathematics, into relentless output. Another deafening blast cut through his thoughts, and the bunker shook violently. A support beam cracked, men shouted. Somewhere, a fire started. Tanaka closed his eyes for a brief moment, and in that moment the truth settled like a final verdict. Whatever happened next, whether they held for days or fell by nightfall, the war had already changed, and the price of realizing that change would be paid entirely in Japanese blood. The bombardment did not end. It evolved. What began as a crushing storm of naval guns slowly transformed into something even more terrifying. A coordinated symphony of destruction. Shells still fell, but now they fell with intent that was impossible to ignore. Every explosion was followed by another that corrected the first, inching closer to command posts, supply routes, and fallback position. It was as if unseen eyes were watching from the sky, calmly adjusting the angle of death. Inside the shattered command network, messages arrived in broken pieces when they arrived at all. Runners replaced radios, sprinting through fire and smoke, many never reaching their destination. Those who did arrived breathless, eyes wild, carrying news that sounded exaggerated, even as the ground shook to confirm it. "They have guns beyond our range," one runner said before collapsing to his knees. "We fire, and there is no reply, only impact." Another arrived moments later, his uniform burned and torn. "Aircraft," he said, coughing violently. "They circle, they strike, they return. Our anti-aircraft fire cannot stop them. They come back as if untouched." In a dimly lit underground chamber, Several generals gathered around what remained of a situation map. The paper was torn, corners burned away, markers scattered by tremors. General Tanaka listened to each report, stripped away another layer of illusion. Every assumption they had built their defenses upon was collapsing in real time. Colonel Ishida leaned heavily on the table, his voice hoarse. Their artillery moves faster than ours. By the time we adjust, they have already advanced. He paused, choosing his words carefully. This is not superior bravery. This is superior capacity. The word lingered in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Capacity, factories, fuel, steel, ammunition measured not in scarcity but in abundance. For years, Japanese doctrine emphasized spirit over material, the belief that resolve could overcome any technological gap. Now that belief was being tested against an enemy who possessed both resolve and an endless supply of firepower. Above them, American aircraft engines droned like distant thunder. Then came the bombs. Precision strikes hammered specific targets, crossroads, hidden depots, entrances to tunnel systems once thought invisible. Each hit felt deliberate, as though the Americans had studied the island more carefully than those who defended it. A young staff officer, his hands shaking, finally spoke what many were thinking but feared to say. They know where we are. No one contradicted him. As the day dragged on, the psychological toll became as devastating as the physical destruction. Men flinched at every sound. Some mistook falling debris for incoming shells and screamed warnings that sent panic rippling through cramped tunnels. Others sat with their backs against the walls, muttering to themselves, reliving explosions that had already passed. Medical stations overflowed. Wounded soldiers lay shoulder to shoulder, some bleeding, some burned, some deafened by the relentless concussion. Morphine ran low. Bandages ran out. Doctors made impossible decisions, turning away men who might have lived under different circumstances. Outside, more shells fell, creating more wounded than could ever be treated. General Tanaka moved among them briefly, offering words he no longer believed. "Endure," he told them. "Hold fast." But each time he said it, the words tasted emptier. Endure what? Hold fast to what remained when the ground itself refused to stay still. By evening, reports confirmed what had once seemed unthinkable. Entire units had ceased to exist, not defeated in battle erased, buried under collapsed tunnels, vaporized at gun position, cut down while retreating through areas that had been turned into killing zones by perfectly timed barrages. In one bunker, a senior artillery officer slammed his fist against the wall in frustration. "We cannot even see the enemy," he shouted. "We die without fighting them." That was the cruelest realization of all. This was not the kind of war they had prepared for. There were no heroic charges, no decisive clashes of will. There was only waiting, listening, and dying as the sky delivered destruction with impersonal efficiency. As night fell, the bombardment did not slow. Instead, flares lit the darkness, turning night into a pale, artificial day. Shadows danced wildly across shattered terrain as shells continued to fall. Sleep became impossible. Every man lived in a constant state of tension, muscles locked, nerves screaming, waiting for the next impact. In the command chamber, Ishida finally spoke again, his voice quiet, stripped of rank and pride. "We told ourselves the Americans were soft," he said, "that they lacked patience for suffering." He looked around at the exhausted faces. But this is patience turned into a weapon. No one argued. Hours later, a message arrived from a coastal observer who had somehow survived. It was short, written in shaking handwriting. They advance behind the fire. The ground itself moves forward. "We cannot lift our heads." Tanaka read it twice, then folded the paper carefully, as if treating it with respect might change its meaning. The Americans were not just destroying, they were advancing under the cover of overwhelming fire, using it as a shield. Every attempt to resist was smothered before it could form. A junior officer whispered, What do we tell Tokyo? Tanaka closed his eyes briefly. He imagined the distant conference rooms, the polished tables, the men who still spoke of honor and final victory. How could words convey this reality? How could paper explain what it felt like to be hunted by an enemy who controlled land, sea, and sky simultaneously? We tell them the truth, Tanaka said at last. Even if it arrives too late. But deep down, he already knew it would arrive too late. By the second night, exhaustion turned into delirium. Some men claimed they could predict incoming shells by sound alone. Others insisted the bombardment had stopped when it clearly had not. Time blurred. Minutes stretched into hours. Hours collapsed into moments of terror. One officer, once known for his unwavering discipline, suddenly began laughing uncontrollably after a near miss threw him against a wall. When others tried to restrain him, he screamed, "Can't you hear it? They will never stop." It took 4 men to hold him down. Tanaka watched the scene in silence. This, too, was a weapon. Firepower that did not merely kill bodies but shattered minds. At dawn, a brief pause settled over the battlefield. It was not silence, just a reduction, a breath held between blows. Men dared to hope it was over. Then the shelling resumed with renewed intensity, striking deeper than before. The pause had been nothing more than repositioning. Colonel Ishida sank onto a crate, suddenly looking every one of his years. "If this continues," he said quietly, "there will be nothing left to defend." Tanaka nodded. "That is the point." The realization spread through the command like a slow poison. This was not a battle meant to be won by bravery. It was a process, a calculation. The Americans were applying pressure until resistance mathematically ceased to exist. No dramatic finale, no glorious last stand, just an inevitable reduction to zero. As another wave of explosions rolled overhead, Ishida spoke words that would echo in Tanaka's memory forever. "We prepared our men to die," he said. "But we did not prepare them for this kind of dying." The chamber shook again, dust falling like grey snow. Somewhere above, another position disappeared from the map. And in that moment, among the rumble of collapsing earth and the distant roar of guns, the Japanese command finally understood the truth they had denied for so long. Courage without firepower was no longer enough, and realization, arriving now, carried the heaviest cost of all. The firing did not stop when the Americans reached the shattered edges of the Japanese defenses. It only changed its voice. What had once been distant thunder became a constant, grinding presence, closer now, heavier, as if the earth itself were being crushed between massive steel plates. Survivors crawled from bunkers that no longer deserved the name, blinking against smoke and ash, unsure whether the silence between explosions meant safety or simply the next breath before death. General Tanaka emerged from the remains of the command bunker at dawn, escorted by 2 officers whose faces were grey with exhaustion. The air was thick with dust that refused to settle, hanging low like a permanent fog. Every step crunched over debris that had once been weapons, tools, or men. The battlefield no longer resembled terrain. It looked like something that had been erased and rewritten by violence. All around him, soldiers moved without direction. Some tried to regroup, clutching rifles with cracked stocks and empty magazines. Others sat motionless beside craters, staring into them as if expecting answers to rise from the smoke. A few still attempted to follow orders, saluting out of habit, though the gestures felt meaningless now. Echoes of a structure that had collapsed. Tanaka stopped at the edge of a massive crater that had swallowed an entire gun position. Twisted metal jutted out like broken bones. He recognized the markings on a shattered artillery wheel. It had belonged to a unit he had personally inspected weeks earlier. The men assigned there had bowed deeply, confident in their preparations. Now there was no trace of them at all. Behind him, Colonel Ishida joined him slowly, limping from a leg wound hastily bandaged. He followed Tanaka's gaze and said nothing for a long time. Then, in a voice stripped of rank, he spoke. "There is no battlefield left, only the remains of one." American aircraft roared overhead, low and unchallenged. They did not fire immediately. They circled, observed, and moved on, as if confident nothing below could threaten them. That casual dominance struck Tanaka harder than any explosion. This was power so absolute. It no longer needed to prove itself at every moment. Runners arrived with final reports, each worse than the last. Ammunition was nearly gone. Water was contaminated. Entire tunnel networks had collapsed, sealing hundreds inside. Attempts at counterattacks had ended before they began, smothered by artillery that anticipated every movement. The few remaining units were isolated, leaderless, and slowly being hunted down. As the morning wore on, American infantry advanced cautiously behind rolling barrages. Whenever Japanese soldiers attempted to rise and fire, shells fell almost instantly, forcing them back into the dirt. It was as if the enemy could see through smoke, through earth, through fear itself. Resistance became an act of suicide rather than defiance. Tanaka retreated into the shadow of a shattered ridge and gathered the remaining senior officers. There were fewer than half of those who had started the battle. Some were wounded, some shell-shocked, all exhausted beyond measure. For a moment, no one spoke. The sounds of distant explosions filled the silence. Finally, Ishida looked up. "This is the end," he said simply. No one disagreed. Tanaka felt the weight of history pressing down on his chest. He had devoted his life to service, to strategy, to the belief that discipline and sacrifice could overcome any obstacle. Now he stood amid ruins that proved otherwise. The war had outrun the values it once claimed to honor. "We must consider surrender," a younger officer said, his voice barely audible. The word hung in the air like a forbidden curse. For decades, it had been unthinkable. Yet now, surrounded by annihilation, it felt less like betrayal and more like an acknowledgement of reality. Tanaka closed his eyes briefly. Images flooded his mind, cities untouched by war, families waiting for sons who would never return, leaders far away still speaking of final victories. He understood then that continuing this fight would not change the outcome. It would only add bodies to the ground that were already saturated with them. Before any decision could be finalized, another wave of American fire swept across nearby positions. The earth shook violently, throwing men to their knees. When the dust cleared, one of the remaining officers lay motionless, killed not by a direct hit, but by debris hurled with unstoppable force. Ishida stared at the body, his expression hollow. "Even now," he murmured, "they decide who lives and who dies." By afternoon, white cloth began appearing across the shattered landscape. Torn uniforms, bandages, anything that could signal surrender. Some Japanese soldiers wept as they raised them, others looked relieved, their fight finally taken from them. A few refused, choosing to disappear into the ruins rather than accept survival on such terms. American soldiers approached cautiously, weapons ready but faces grim. They had seen the destruction too. Victory did not look glorious here. It looked like a wasteland. Tanaka was escorted toward an American command post set amid comparatively untouched ground, protected by layers of firepower that had never faltered. As he walked, he heard the distant echo of guns still firing elsewhere. On the island, pockets of resistance being extinguished one by one. Inside the American command area, everything felt unreal. Radios worked, maps were clean and updated. Soldiers moved with confidence, unshaken by fear. The contrast was staggering. This was the other side of the storm, the calm at its center. An American officer addressed Tanaka through an interpreter, his tone firm but not cruel. Formalities were observed, but the outcome was never in doubt. The battle was over. The result had been decided long before the first shell landed. Later, as Tanaka sat alone under guard, he replayed the past days in his mind. The moment of disbelief when the bombardment began, the slow collapse of assumption, the dawning realization that bravery alone could not stand against such overwhelming force. He thought of the words Ishida had spoken earlier and understood their full meaning now. This was not merely defeat, it was revelation. In the days that followed, as prisoners were gathered and the battlefield was surveyed, the scale of destruction became fully visible. Entire defensive systems had been erased. What had taken years to build had been destroyed in days, Engineers measured craters larger than buildings. Medical teams uncovered bodies buried so deep they had been crushed by the weight of the earth itself. Japanese officers spoke quietly among themselves, sharing bitter reflections. We underestimated their industry. We believed spirit could replace steel. We mistook restraint for weakness. Each admission came too late to change anything. One general, older than the rest, stood overlooking the ruins and spoke words that spread quickly among the survivors. Had we truly understood their firepower, he said, we would have known this war was already lost. The sentence carried no anger, only sorrow. For Tanaka, the war did not end with surrender. It ended in understanding. Understanding that modern warfare had crossed a threshold where belief could no longer compensate for imbalance. Understanding that nations now fought not just with men, but with factories, logistics, and relentless calculation. Understanding that honor, once central to battle, had become a casualty of scale. As he was transported away from the island, Tanaka looked back one last time. Smoke still rose from the earth, drifting slowly into the sky. The guns were silent now, but their message lingered, written permanently into the land and into memory. The Americans had not merely defeated an army. They had demonstrated a new reality of War One, where resistance could be erased before it could even fully form. And the cruelest truth of all was that this lesson had been learned only after everything worth defending had already been reduced to ashes. The island faded into the distance, but the words spoken in its ruins would echo long after the war itself ended, a quiet warning etched into history. When understanding arrives too late, the cost is not just defeat, it is devastation beyond recovery.